What's up? DM Ted here from Dude Where's My D20, coming at you today with my top 5 RPGs that aren't D&D. These are just my opinion, obviously. If you get your outrage panties on because of it, that's your problem. Number 5, Vampire the Masquerade Revised Edition. I'm saying Revised Edition specifically here. There's other editions. If you prefer those, feel free to try them. But I recommend Revised because to me, that was when they had perfected the sauce of the setting itself. I'm not saying the mechanics are the best version of the mechanics. In fact, they're definitely not. But the setting itself was at its peak in Revised Edition. Okay, what's great about Vampire the Masquerade? The gothic punk aesthetic. It's urban gothic, modern world, very cool stuff. It is a game very much revolving around deep role play. There isn't a lot of black and white morality here. It's about the choices you make and consequences, plain and simple. Cons of this system, because I'm putting you in the Wayback Machine, it has some outdated, clunky mechanics. We've come a long way in RPG design since then, and there's some stuff that just could be a lot better. Another con is that there's a lot of lore, and it can be daunting for new players to get into, and you're going to hear me say that with some of these other systems coming up too. The big con on this game is the potential for player versus player. Because Vampire is very much a game about competing machinations behind the scenes, players have to be mature enough to handle opposing ideas, the fact that there's sometimes winners and losers, and sometimes somebody gets killed, and you just got to be a grown-up and deal with it. Number 4, Cyberpunk Red. Do not be chased away by the fact that Cyberpunk 2077, the game, didn't turn out as great as a lot of people had hoped. We're talking about the tabletop RPG. Set in the same world, so if you didn't like the video game for setting and story reasons, this probably isn't for you. What I like about Cyberpunk, and really you can play any edition of Cyberpunk, they're kind of all the same. Cyberpunk Red just happens to be the newest version. What I like about it is it's near future. The technology is stuff that you could see existing based on what we currently have. I'm a fan of, as you may have guessed by me recommending Vampire, I'm a fan of darker themes, which is important to Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is about corporate greed, government corruption, all this kind of stuff. The cons here, once again, they didn't update the system much for Red, so again, clunky mechanics, legacy 20-plus-year-old mechanics. The game, and additionally, the game can be highly lethal. You kind of need a well-rounded group in Cyberpunk, but characters that are built for combat can soak up damage and output so much damage. But the other characters that you need, like the characters that hack into computer systems, tend to be a lot more squishy and can be taken down very easily. So that some players aren't going to enjoy that degree of imbalance between characters who specialize in different things. Moving on, number 3. Star Wars, any system. There's been a number of official Star Wars RPGs, starting way back in the 80s with the West End Games D6 system, which is a lot of fun. It's cinematic. It does feel like an older system if you're used to more modern systems, but it's still fun. Then we had the late 90s, early 2000s, around the time that the Star Wars prequels came out. Wizards of the Coast, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, put out a version of D&D based on Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. There was 3 of those. I would recommend Revised of those 3, where it'd be D20 Revised, and then Saga Edition. I recommend Revised. That's just me. I think it's the best of those rule sets. Any of them is going to play kind of like D&D. You've got skill points, you've got hit points, take damage, all that kind of stuff, standard attack rolls, characters have feats, race, character class, all that kind of stuff is going to be very familiar to D&D players. The current system by Fantasy Flight Games, I ran for the dudes once, they hated it. I love it. That's fine, because again, my point is there's lots of different versions to play. Pros of a Star Wars game, it's Star Wars, man. The cons of a Star Wars game, it's Star Wars, man. Lots of different people, lots of different ideas of what Star Wars can be, should be, yada yada, you get it. Super cool, a lot of fun, but expectations and stuff like that can get in the way. Number 2, Conan, Adventures in an Age Undreamed Of. Very unwieldy name for a very cool RPG, obviously based in the world of Conan the Barbarian. It takes more from the stories of Robert Howard. It does not borrow much from the movies or comic books or other media. you. What I love here is that this is a fantasy game like Dungeons & Dragons, but completely unlike Dungeons & Dragons. I hope to run this game for the dudes at some point. So if you watch us, maybe you'll get a look at this. Conan tends to have episodic adventures rather than what you'd call in D&D a campaign. It's not a long-term effort to stop Takesis from entering the world, as in the Horde of the Dragon Queen adventure in D&D. It's you go out, you have an adventure, you'll earn some gold, you go back somewhere, you live the high life until you run out of gold, then you go out and you have another adventure, probably unrelated to the first one. That's how Conan works. It's a very mercenary-based type of game, and it's a lot of fun. And this game is done by a company called Modifius, and it uses a 2D20 system, which they have licensed for a lot of other RPGs. I find it innovative and fun, but there is a con here. This system has a lot of moving parts, and it can be hard for the GM to keep it all going forward without having to constantly reference things. There's a lot of status effects and things. On the player side, players might struggle with how much this game is not D&D. Magic, for instance, is both rare and highly dangerous in the world of Conan. You're not going to be loaded up with magic items. They simply don't exist. And when you encounter spellcasters, players can play them, but there's a danger to using magic. There's a cost. It's very, very powerful relative to D&D, but costly and dangerous. And to me, that's what makes it fun. Before we move on to number one, I'm going to do some honorable mentions real quick. Start with 7th Sea. Any version, doesn't really matter. 7th Sea is a swashbuckling, heroic adventure game, very much in the vein of Pirates of the Caribbean, because there's a supernatural element to it. Three Musketeers, Man in the Iron Mask, Count of Monte Cristo, whatever. I also recommend checking out pretty much all of the old World of Darkness. Vampire the Masquerade was part of that family. I'm going to give a special shout out to Werewolf the Wild West, which is a personal favorite. And then I'm going to shout out some of Modifius's other 2D20 games. Particularly, I recommend checking out Achtung Cthulhu, which is a pulp horror game set in World War II. Very Hellboy-ish vibes, very cool. They also have the licenses for the science fiction franchises Star Trek and Dune, and I think those are very cool. My last honorable mention is a game called Marvel Heroic. It is no longer in print, but it was fantastic. As quickly as I can, the thing that this system has that no other superhero system that I've encountered does is all of that cool superhero stuff, like throwing your enemy through a wall. All of that can be done, and it can be adjudicated quickly. It's just, there's a lot of fun to be had here. Unfortunately, the downside of Heroic is you can really only play the existing Marvel heroes. It does not work well with creating your own. All right, drum roll, please. Number one, Legend of the Five Rings. I absolutely love this setting. I've been in love with it since a friend of mine introduced me to it many years ago. One of the same friends that introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons itself in the first place. What Legend of the Five Rings is a samurai fantasy game, but it is not like D&D. It revolves around the samurai culture and all of the kind of ins and outs of that culture. I can't go into it too much without making this way too long, but I absolutely adore this setting. I highly recommend checking it out. You definitely won't see me run this one with the dudes, because their take on interacting with NPCs would end up with them getting executed in the very first scene.
Their fucking Google page.
I'm on DoorDash, bitch.
It says it right here on their motherfucking menu.
Welcome back, everybody.
The pros of Legend of the Five Rings, it's an immersive setting rich with lore. There's just a lot going on, and you kind of have to dive headlong in or you won't last, and I like that. And it's different from any other RPG out there. The social aspect is so important, and it's got its own cool lore. It borrows heavily from different areas of Asia and India for its lore. There are monsters here, there is magic here, but it's not like D&D, it's not like Conan. It is its own thing, and I love it for that. The cons are all those role-playing things that I talked about can be very much a straitjacket. It can be hard to get into as a player because it is so restrictive in terms of behavior. There are things that are expected of samurai, and if you don't do them, it can go badly for for you. Number 2 con here is it doesn't matter which edition you play. I recommend 1st edition, by the way, the very first edition that came out, or 5th edition, which is the most recent, which have very different mechanics, just because those are my 2 favorite versions. But honestly, any of those editions in between 2nd, 3rd, 4th, they're all fine. The mechanics, it doesn't really matter which one you pick, can be difficult. It's not so much that they're clunky and old school as it is that they're just trying to pack a lot of different things into these rules, and it can be really, really difficult. The other con here from the player side is there is a lot of lore, and it can be daunting to get in. If you're looking to get into this as a player, they kind of give you 2 quote-unquote starter clans you can choose from that are easier for people to start off with the setting from, because those clans aren't necessarily as immersed in the culture of the setting. But I recommend checking out Legend of the Five Rings. It's a good time. In any case, whatever games you're playing, enjoy them, have a good time, and keep on gaming out there, folks.